December arrived with dark skies and heavy rain. All across the region, farmers did their best to plant seed for the next harvest, yet many had abandoned their fields in order to search for food. It wasn't long before their land was choked with weeds. My father managed to plant a small plot of maize, but without any fertilizer. He also found enough seed for a half-acre of tobacco, which would prove a lifesaver in the months to come. What began as drought and hunger in Malawi soon evolved into full-blown famine. That winter it would tighten its grip until few people were left standing. Those looking for food began to cluster in the trading center and along the roads. Groups of men carrying their hoes went house to house asking for work, their clothes soaked from the rain and covered in mud. At each place they heard the same reply, "We have nothing to give." While the men searched for Ganyu, their wives gathered at the chief's house, where Gilbert passed out bags of flour at the door. Already hundreds of people had received food, and more kept coming. They carried children who cried from empty bellies, and some women were so weak that they fainted once they arrived. After Gilbert's mother nursed them back to health, they continued down the road in search for their next bite. The famine arrived at our door sooner than I imagined. During the second week of December, my mother milled our last pail of maize, giving us just 12 more meals. As soon as she left, I opened the storage room and peered inside. All that remained were empty bags piled in a corner, like dirty laundry. I tried to remember what the room had looked like when it was full, but I just didn't have the energy. That night, my father called the family into the living room. Given our situation, he said, "I've decided it's better if we go down to 1 meal per day. It's the only way we'll make it." My sisters and I argued over which meal it would be. "We should have breakfast," said Aisha, who was 12. "I like lunch," shouted Doris. "No," my father said, "it will be supper. It's easier to keep your mind off hunger during the day. But no person should have to sleep with an empty stomach. We'll eat at night." My stomach was used to being fed every time it grumbled. Having no breakfast was one thing, but not eating breakfast or lunch was a lesson in patience and pain. It was even harder on my younger sisters, who didn't understand why no one would feed them. "Did you hear me, Mama?" they cried. "I'm hungry." "Yes, dear," my mother said. "I heard you. Just try to hold on." Dinner didn't come soon enough the first night. My father lit a lantern in the living room, and we all gathered around, watching the black soot spiral toward the ceiling. As usual, we started with hand-washing. My sister Doris walked around to each person and poured the warm water over their hands while they lathered up with soap and rinsed over the basin. When washing was finished, finally my mother fetched 2 bowls and lifted the lids. "Try to make it last," she said, and joined us on the floor. The first bowl contained Nizma, but instead of a mountain of steaming cakes, this one was gray blob. It didn't even look edible. In the second bowl, my mother had prepared a small portion of mustard greens. We passed the food around and didn't even bother using plates. The meal was over in minutes. With less than 1 pail of flour remaining, I knew that only a miracle could save us, or at least a very good idea. The next morning, my father announced his brilliant plan. "We're selling all our food," he said. It didn't make any sense to me. In fact, it seemed like the worst idea I'd ever heard. But then he explained how we'll use the flour to make cakes to sell in the market. The extra money we earned would go toward buying more food. It was a huge gamble. That next morning, my mother mixed the last of our flour with some soy powder and sugar and made zagumu cakes, which resembled small biscuits. The delicious smell of them baking over the fire drifted through the sheets of rain and onto the road, stopping the Ganyu men in their tracks. Even the birds became brave and gathered outside the kitchen to sing a woeful tune. The aroma seemed to enter my body like a spirit, slithering into my empty belly and stretching its arms and legs. Normally when my mother made zagumu cakes, she'd let me scrape the bowl with my fingers. In Malawi, this was such a cherished privilege that kids had given it a name, VP, after Vapasi pot, meaning the bottom of the pot. "Mama, VP?" we'd ask, our eyes round with anticipation. But this time was different. My mother used every last drop of batter, as if wiping it clean with a sponge. No VP, only empty pot. That night, my father made a stand from a broken table and an iron sheet. My mother opened for business the following morning, selling her cakes for 3 kwacha each. The cakes were heavy and lasted longer in the belly than some of the other cheap breads for sale in the market. If a person didn't have enough money to buy flour, the cakes were their only option. That first day, she sold out in less than 20 minutes. During these hard times, everyone learned the lesson of supply and demand. The rule of economics says that whenever the supply of something is great, say that farmers have a good crop like any normal year, the demand will be low, and so will the price. But when it's the opposite, when the supply is low, like it was during the famine, the demand is overwhelming and the prices soar into the heavens. Ever since the country ran out of maize, businessmen had been traveling into neighboring countries like Tanzania and buying it by the truckful. Back in Wimby Market, they raised the price, partly because gasoline was expensive and sometimes the trucks broke down, but also they charged more because they knew people were starving and would pay anything to stay alive. Luckily, one of the traders, Mr. Manguchi, was my father's friends and agreed to cut us a deal. For the money my mother earned selling cakes, Manguchi sold her another pail of maize. My mother took it to the mill, saving half the flour for more cakes, while the other half went to us. It was just enough to provide our blob of nizma each night, plus some pumpkin or mustard leaves as relish. It didn't erase our hunger, but knowing our one meal was safe made it seem less painful. As long as we can stay in business, we can make it through, my father told us. Our profit is that we stay alive.